Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. I thought my proposal joke was just harmless relief after a brutal week. Seconds later, I realized I had uncovered two truths. The woman I trusted most had loved me for years, and my family was plotting to steal my life. I unknowingly triggered a fake contract and a dirty betrayal behind my back. Now I do not just want love. I want those who calculated to bury me with lies to destroy themselves in front of everyone. My name is Nora Hughes. I am 34 years old, living in a brick row house in Baltimore, and for the better part of a decade, I have made a comfortable living putting out fires that other people start. As a senior compliance manager at Astor Mobility Group, my professional existence revolves around foreseeing disasters. I spot the cracks in the corporate foundation long before the building threatens to collapse. If a supplier tries to slide a shady agreement through our system, I drop the hammer. People call me smart, calm, and unshakable. Yet, the grand irony of my life is that while I manage corporate catastrophes, I am completely oblivious to the ones brewing in my own living room. For the past 7 years, the only real constant in my chaotic personal life has been Greer Holloway. Greer is my best friend, my sounding board, and the only person who can read my mind before I'd open my mouth. She works as a title examiner at Breyer and Locke Title Services. It is a job that suits her perfectly. Greer is sharp, fiercely private, and possesses an almost terrifying ability to sift through layers of bureaucratic garbage to find the hidden truth. While I manage the present, she excavates the past. Whenever my life inevitably crumbles, she is always standing right there, waiting patiently to catch me. Our friendship did not start with a grand collision. It started in the pitch black. 7 years ago, a massive power outage hit our block of aging apartments in Mount Vernon. I was standing in the dim hallway, clutching a melting pint of chocolate, ice cream, and a dying flashlight when the door across from mine creaked open. Greer stepped out, holding a lantern and a bottle of red wine. We sat on the dusty wooden stairs in the dark, drinking straight from the bottle, trading terrible stories about our landlords. From that single night on, we simply became a fundamental habit for each other. We were the late-night diner runs after terrible dates. We were the endless cardboard boxes hauled up narrow staircases during 3 different apartment moves. We became the architecture of each other's daily lives. Because we are so close, people looking from the outside always assume Greer and I are a couple. It is a running joke at dinner parties. I have always brushed it off with a dismissive laugh. I never thought of us that way. Mostly because my romantic life has always been a string of exhausting disasters with men. The most recent disaster was Dalton Raw. Dalton is an urban redevelopment broker. On paper, he is the perfect catch. He is polished, charming, and wears custom suits that cost more than my first car. But underneath that tailored exterior is a man who desperately needs to control every breathing second of the people around him. Our relationship felt less like a partnership and more like a hostile corporate takeover. I finally put an end to it 2 months ago. I thought I had reclaimed my sense of air, but breaking up with Dalton only made him change his tactics. That brings us to tonight. It has been an unhinged week at work. We had 3 massive internal audits and a vendor dispute that kept me at the office until 8 in the evening every single day. To make matters worse, my phone has been vibrating relentlessly with texts from Dalton. He is not begging for me back. Instead, he has pivoted entirely to obsessing over the 3-story row house in Fells Point that my grandmother left me when she passed away last year. It is a crumbling, beautiful old place, and Dalton has spent the last 12 months trying to convince me to sell it to his firm so they can bulldoze it. I told him no 100 times. Today alone, he sent 14 lengthy messages about market values, property surveys, and how I am being financially irresponsible. I felt like I was drowning, suffocated by his relentless pressure. I desperately needed to breathe, so I showed up at the apartment building where Greer lives unannounced. She lives on the top floor, with a makeshift patio out on the roof, accessible by a rusty fire escape. When I arrived, she took one look at my face, handed me a glass of cold gin, and pointed toward the roof access door without saying a word. We sat up there for 2 hours. The Baltimore skyline hummed in the distance, a glowing smear of orange and yellow against the pitch-black sky. The humid summer air clung to my skin, but the alcohol was finally starting to untie the tight knots in my shoulders. Greer sat across from me on a canvas lounge chair, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She was wearing an oversized gray sweater, the warm breeze messing with her short dark hair. She just listened as I unloaded everything. I ranted about Asterin. I ranted about the endless audits. And then I started in on Dalton. I talked about the house, the texts, and the endless pressure of trying to navigate a life where people only see you for what they can take from you. I threw my hands up in the air, the ice clinking loudly in my empty glass. I told her I was completely exhausted. I told her I was tired of trying to fit myself into the rigid boxes that men like Dalton built to keep me trapped. I was tired of feeling like a project to be managed instead of a person who just wanted to be loved quietly. I let out a bitter laugh, staring at the empty space between our chairs. I shook my head and blurted out the thought exactly as it formed in my tired brain. At this point, I should probably just marry my best friend for peace of mind. It was a throwaway line. It was a defense mechanism wrapped up in a sarcastic bow. I fully expected Greer to roll her eyes. I expected her to toss a sofa cushion at my head or make a dry comment about how I would be a terrible wife because I never remember to fold my laundry. Instead, there was nothing but silence. I turned my head to look at her. Greer was not laughing. She was not reaching for her drink. She was just looking at me. Her gaze was heavy, anchored to my face, and there was an intensity in her dark eyes that made my breath catch in my throat. She looked at me longer than she ever had in all our 7 years, studying my expression as if she were trying to memorize the exact shape of the moment. I felt a strange, nervous flutter deep in my chest. To break the tension, my reflex kicked in, half joking, half tipsy, and desperate to return to our safe dynamic. I leaned forward. I held out my empty glass like a microphone, offering a crooked smile, and added to the joke. "All right, marry me then." The words hung in the humid air. I kept my smile up, waiting for the punchline. I waited for her to laugh and break the spell, but Greer stood completely still. Her shoulders dropped slightly, losing their usual rigid posture. Her dark eyes lowered, the guarded, sharp exterior she wore for the rest of the world melting away in a fraction of a second. She looked like someone who had been standing out in the freezing rain for years, and someone had finally opened the front door to let her in. She did not smile. She did not laugh. She just looked at me with an expression so vulnerable, so completely raw and undefended that it made my heart pound wildly against my ribs. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the noise of the city below us like a razor blade. "I thought you would never ask me." The sentence dropped between us, quiet and absolute. In an instant, the entire atmosphere on the rooftop shifted violently. The warm summer breeze felt suddenly electric and dangerous. The sarcastic, easy comfort of our Friday night vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, undeniable gravity. I stared at her, my mind racing, scrambling frantically to rewind the last 7 years. I thought about the late nights, the quiet moments, the fierce way she always protected me from everyone else. I realized with a sudden and terrifying clarity that sobered me up instantly that the thing I had just awakened was not a joke. It had never been a joke. I did not breathe. I could not. The humid air around us felt like it had turned to solid glass, trapping the two of us inside a terrarium of sudden, unbearable tension. I stared at the woman sitting across from me, searching her face for the punchline. The smirk, the familiar eye roll that would signal we were still safely inside the boundaries of our platonic dynamic. That the lines of her face were perfectly still, save for a microscopic tremor in her lower lip. She was shaking. It was barely visible, a subtle vibration traveling through her shoulders down to her tightly clenched hands resting on her knees. She looked exactly like a person who had just stepped off a ledge and was bracing for the violent impact of the ground. My voice abandoned me. The city noise below us faded into a dull, meaningless hum. She did not look away. Her dark eyes held mine with a terrifying, desperate kind of courage. She told me she had loved me for years. The words poured out of her, not in a frantic, desperate rush, but in a slow, heavy stream, as if she were lifting massive stones off her chest one by one and placing them between us. She confessed how agonizing it had been to sit on the sidelines for nearly a decade. She described the quiet torture of playing the role of the loyal, supportive confidant, while I tangled my life up in half-hearted romances with men who never truly saw me, men who treated me like a decorative asset rather than a human being. She kept her mouth shut. She explained, her voice cracking over the syllables, because she was terrified that speaking the truth would detonate the only stable foundation she had in her life. She would rather have a fraction of me as a friend, she said, rather than risk losing me entirely as a rejected lover. She had chosen the slow burn of silence over the immediate destruction of a rejection. As she spoke, my mind violently pulled me backward, dragging me through 1,000 memories that suddenly looked entirely different under this harsh, illuminating new light. I remembered getting my major corporate promotion 2 years ago. The very first number I dialed from the cab ride home was hers. Not my mother, not the man I was sharing a bed with at the time. I remembered how no matter where I lived or what apartment I was renting, the safest place in the world had always been leaning against the cool marble counter of her kitchen, drinking hot tea in silence while she cooked dinner. I remembered the catastrophic aftermath of every single breakup I had ever endured. When the dust settled, when the men packed their expensive bags and the front door clicked shut, it was always her shadow stretching across my hardwood floor. It was always her hands picking up the fragmented pieces of my confidence that I had dropped. She was not just my best friend. She had been the quiet, steadfast architect of my emotional survival every time I fell. She was the floor that caught me. I did not cross the space between our chairs to pull her into a grand, cinematic embrace. That is not who we are, and that is not how reality works. My chest was incredibly tight, my heart pounding a frantic, bruised rhythm against my ribs. But I needed to be painfully, entirely honest with her. I told her I was dizzy. I told her my brain felt like a snow globe that had just been violently shaken, and the pieces were still blindingly swirling in the air. Yet, even as I confessed my overwhelming shock, I could not deny the profound, terrifying sense of rightness settling deep into my bones. The scattered puzzle pieces of our shared history were locking together, forming a magnificent picture I had been too blind to see for 7 years. We sat there in the fading heat of the rooftop and made a quiet, ironclad pact. We agreed we would not turn this fragile, massive truth into a rushed, messy decision. We were not chaotic 20-somes desperate for a dramatic, whirlwind romance. We were grown women with deep scars and complicated lives. And if we were going to cross this monumental line, we were going to walk slowly. We were going to be entirely deliberate. We would not risk our solid foundation on a sudden wine-fueled impulse. We would step into this new reality with our eyes wide open. When I finally left her apartment building and drove back to my own neighborhood, the atmosphere inside my car felt bizarrely thick. My heart was incredibly soft, wrapped in a warm, unfamiliar comfort that made my hands grip the steering wheel loosely. But my head was throbbing with an entirely different kind of weight. The moment I walked through my front door, the harsh metallic reality of my actual life slammed back into me with the force of a freight train. My phone screen lit up on the dark kitchen island, buzzing aggressively against the granite. It was another email from my ex. He was demanding in his usual passive-aggressive corporate tone that I sign a survey authorization document for the property my grandmother had left me. I dropped my keys on the counter, the metallic clatter echoing sharply in the quiet, empty rooms of my house. I stared at the glowing screen. The soft warmth of the rooftop evaporated instantly, replaced by the suffocating familiar grip of my current crisis. I needed to hear her voice again, not as a newfound romantic prospect, but as the brilliant, sharp mind I relied on to navigate the bureaucratic nightmares of the world. I dialed her number. She picked up on the exact second ring. I paced the length of my living room, the old hardwood floors creaking under my bare feet, and began to lay out the full ugly truth about the property. I explained the sheer exhaustion of dealing with the 3-story row house in the historic district. It was the absolute last thing my grandmother owned, her final anchor in this city a place filled with the smell of old pine and decades of family history. My ex had spent the better part of a year trying to pry it out of my hands. He wanted me to sell it to his redevelopment firm so they could gut its soul and flip it into sterile luxury condos. I told her about his relentless pressure, the subtle guilt trips, the constant degrading implications that I was not financially literate enough to manage a real estate asset of that magnitude. I told her he sent another contract tonight. I rubbed my throbbing temples, feeling a headache blossoming behind my eyes. I explained that he kept pushing this specific holding company on me, Port Meridian Holdings. He swore up and down they were the only buyers willing to take on the massive structural risk of a century-old building. The silence on the other end of the cellular line was immediate, absolute, and freezing. When she finally spoke, her voice had completely changed. The soft, vulnerable tone from the rooftop was entirely eradicated. In its place was the razor-sharp, cold, clinical edge of a seasoned title examiner who had just spotted blood in the water. She demanded that I say the name of the company again, her words clipped and vibrating with urgent intensity. I repeated the name Port Meridian Holdings, stopping dead in my tracks in the middle of the hallway. A cold and heavy knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. I asked her what was wrong. I could hear the frantic, rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard through the phone speaker. She told me that she had been flagging that exact corporate entity in her office system for the past 3 weeks. She had seen their name popping up in a series of highly irregular, shadowy land title searches across the eastern side of the city. They were moving entirely too fast, acquiring distressed historic properties through opaque shell corporations and leaving a bizarre trail of questionable notarizations in their wake. They were not just a regular corporate buyer looking for a good deal. They were a predatory machine designed to swallow vulnerable properties through obscure legal loopholes. She ordered me not to sign a single thing he sent. Her voice was vibrating with a fierce, terrifyingly protective anger. She told me not to even open the digital attachments. She insisted that something was fundamentally criminally wrong and that this was not just my ex being a pushy, arrogant broker. He was actively trying to tie my name and my family legacy to a toxic shell company. I promised her I would not touch the documents. We hung up, the heavy click of the call ending, leaving me standing alone in the center of my dark living room. The digital clock on my microwave glowed a neon green in the shadows, marking exactly midnight. I walked over to the kitchen island, my hands shaking slightly as I picked up my phone to close the email application and go to sleep. But right as my thumb swiped the screen to refresh the inbox, a brand new message dropped into the queue. It was not from him. It was an automated system notification from a secure third-party legal document portal. The subject line was written in bold, sterile, bureaucratic text. It stated clearly that my digital signature had been successfully received, authenticated, and verified for the survey authorization and the intent to sell agreement. A wave of absolute terrifying ice crashed over my body, paralyzing my lungs and freezing the blood in my veins. I stared at the glowing white letters until they physically blurred in my vision. I had not opened the portal. I had not clicked a single secure link. I had absolutely not signed my name to anything tonight or any other night. But the unfailing digital system was permanently registering that I had just signed away the first layer of protection on my grandmother's legacy. The deeply emotional confession on the roof had awakened a beautiful long-buried truth, but the sterile email arriving exactly at midnight confirmed a horrifying immediate reality. I was not just being aggressively pressured to sell a piece of real estate. I was actively being legally erased from my own life. Signature by forged signature by someone who firmly believed I was entirely too weak and too blind to notice the betrayal unfolding right in front of me. The morning sun felt excessively harsh as it filtered through my bedroom blinds. I had not slept a single minute. By 6:00, I was already sitting at my kitchen island with my laptop open, bypassing the automated notification email and logging directly into the secure legal portal through a backdoor directory. My corporate compliance training kicked in, pushing the raw panic aside and replacing it with a cold, methodical focus. I pulled the master ledger for the property. There was not just one document. There were three distinct, legally binding files newly attached to my grandmother's address. The first was a structural survey permission form. The second was a memorandum of option to purchase. The third was a comprehensive site access confirmation. I opened each digital file, my eyes scanning the bottom of the pages. There, glaring back at me in perfectly rendered electronic ink, was my signature. I checked the embedded timestamps. The option to purchase was executed at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The site access confirmation followed at 3:45 the same day. I pulled up my company employee portal on a separate tab and downloaded my badge swipe history for that specific Tuesday. At 2:15, I was locked inside a windowless conference room on the fourth floor. At 3:45, I was scanning my identification badge at the lobby turnstile to pick up a catering order. I had an ironclad physical alibi, yet the digital system was permanently claiming I was simultaneously signing away my inheritance. Greer was at my kitchen counter by 7:30. She did not bother with pleasantries or gentle greetings. She dropped her oversized leatherwork tote on the floor, pulled a pair of blue light reading glasses from her pocket, and took control of my laptop. Watching her work was like watching a forensic accountant dissect a financial crime scene. She did not look at the signatures themselves. She looked at the metadata buried beneath them. She opened up a command line interface on my screen, her fingers flying across the keys with practiced aggression. She explained that standard electronic signatures generate a unique digital fingerprint that logs the specific device and Internet protocol address used at the exact moment of signing. She pointed a manicured finger at the screen, tapping the glass lightly. She showed me that the authentication code chains on my three documents did not match the standard protocol for a direct user login. They were entirely washed. The verification stamps had been forcibly routed through a highly suspicious intermediary signing portal. It was a digital laundering technique used to mask the original location of whoever clicked the approval button. Then she highlighted the electronic notary seal at the very end of the memorandum. The name printed under the digital stamp made her jaw tighten. Kent Barlow Greer told me she had flagged his license number twice in the past 6 months at her title agency. He was a known ghost notary, someone who rubber-stamped shady commercial real estate transfers for anonymous shell companies without ever verifying the actual identity of the signer. They had bypassed me completely, using a compromised external portal and a dirty notary to legally bind the property without my knowledge. I was still processing the sheer scale of the fraud when my cellular phone rang at 8:45. It was the head of internal audit at my company. He did not ask if I was on my way to the office. He simply ordered me to report directly to the Human Resources Compliance floor the second I arrived. An hour later, I was sitting across from three senior auditors in a sterile room that smelled of ozone and stale coffee. They did not offer me a glass of water. The lead auditor, a man with thinning gray hair and absolutely zero empathy, slid a printed spreadsheet across the table. He asked me to explain why. At exactly 4:00 on a Wednesday 2 weeks prior, my specific administrative credentials were used to fast-track the approval of a new, unvetted consulting vendor. I looked down at the highlighted row on the paper. The vendor name jumped off the page and wrapped its invisible hands around my throat. Port Meridian Advisory. My lungs forgot how to process oxygen. The room tilted violently. My own company had just flagged my account for authorizing future corporate payments to a subsidiary of the exact same holding company that was currently stealing my private real estate. The trap was so brilliantly, horrifically designed that I could barely breathe. To the internal auditors sitting across from me, it looked exactly like I was running a massive illegal conflict of interest scheme. It looked like I was using my high-level corporate clearance to funnel company funds into a vendor that I was personally doing private real estate business with. They were flawlessly linking my professional livelihood to the very people robbing me. I was escorted out of the building on a temporary administrative leave pending a full forensic investigation. I was standing on the glaring concrete sidewalk in front of the corporate tower, holding a cardboard box containing my desk plants and a few framed photos when Dalton suddenly appeared. He stepped out of a black town car, wearing a charcoal gray suit, looking entirely too polished for a random weekday morning encounter. He rushed over to me, his face twisted into a mask of deep manufactured concern. He reached out to take the heavy box from my hands, playing the role of the reliable savior, arriving perfectly on cue. He told me not to panic. He lowered his voice, acting as if he were letting me in on a closely guarded secret. He said he had heard through his corporate network that my company was giving me a hard time about some vendor approvals. He smoothly suggested that I was probably just overwhelmed, that the stress of managing the historic house and our recent breakup had caused me to make some sloppy administrative errors. Then came the pitch. He promised he could clean up all the misunderstandings. He claimed he had deep connections with the holding company and could easily make the vendor issue at my office disappear entirely. All I had to do, he said with a reassuring practice smile, was sign a few final cooperation papers to officially transfer the row house. He framed it as a generous rescue mission. Give him the house, and he would magically fix the corporate investigation that was currently destroying my career. I stared at his perfectly styled hair and his sympathetic eyes. His tone was entirely wrong. It was too smooth. His script was too perfectly prepared. He knew exactly what trouble I was in with the internal auditors before I had even spoken a single word to anyone outside that windowless room. He knew because he was the one who put me there. I pulled my cardboard box back tightly against my chest. Stepping away from his outstretched hands, I told him absolutely not. The mask of the concerned savior shattered instantly. The fake warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness that I had never truly seen during our entire relationship. He adjusted his silk tie and lowered his voice to a chilling flat whisper. He informed me that my grandmother's crumbling house was sitting dead in the center of a multi-million-dollar high-value real estate cluster. The surrounding lots had already been quietly acquired. My tiny sliver of land was the only thing stopping a massive commercial zoning shift. He said his wealthy investors were not going to let one stubborn, overly emotional woman halt a district-wide redevelopment project. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, and told me that if I continued to be difficult, things were only going to get significantly worse for me. He promised that the internal audit at my office was just the absolute beginning of my problems. He got back into the back seat of his town car and drove away, leaving me standing alone on the busy sidewalk. The final pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together in my mind. I was not dealing with a simple boundary dispute. I was not facing a string of unfortunate administrative errors or a bitter ex-boyfriend trying to score a quick real estate commission. They had hijacked my digital identity to forge real estate contracts and then used my corporate credentials to frame me for financial embezzlement. They were meticulously constructing a crime scene where I was not the victim of a stolen inheritance. I was being set up to look like the corrupt mastermind. They were going to steal my family legacy, and they were going to use my own professional ruin as the smoke screen to get away with it. I drove north to the suburbs of Towson to see my mother. Elaine Hughes lived in a pristine, meticulously manicured colonial home where the lawn was always perfectly cut and nothing was ever out of place. I walked into her formal sitting room, my chest incredibly tight, carrying the suffocating weight of the entire morning. I desperately needed a parent. I needed someone to look at the massive injustice collapsing on top of me and offer a shred of unconditional support. I sat on the edge of her expensive floral sofa and laid out the nightmare. I told her about the digital trap that had just been triggered. I told her that the man I used to date was actively trying to steal the house my grandmother left me. I expected her face to drain of color. I expected outrage, or at least a frantic phone call to a family attorney to defend her own mother's legacy. Instead, Elaine simply adjusted the cuffs of her cashmere cardigan and placed her porcelain teacup softly on the glass coffee table. She did not look shocked in the slightest. She looked entirely exhausted by my presence. She sighed heavily, crossing her legs, and told me in a flat, monotone voice that I needed to stop being so deeply dramatic. She looked me dead in the eyes and said I needed to start being practical for once in my life. She called my attachment to the historic property a childish, irrational emotion. She said holding on to a crumbling brick building with terrible plumbing was not an act of love for my grandmother, but a ridiculous act of stubbornness that was causing unnecessary stress for everyone around me. I stared at her, the blood rushing violently in my ears. I pushed further, my voice rising in volume, trying to make her understand the severe criminal nature of the situation. Then, the most devastating truth slipped casually from her perfectly painted lips. She told me she had already spoken to him. My mother admitted without a single ounce of guilt that she had met my ex-boyfriend for lunch on 3 separate occasions over the past 2 months. She defended him. She said he was a highly reasonable man with a solid, lucrative vision for the neighborhood. My stomach dropped completely through the floor when she casually mentioned that she had given him the spare brass key to my grandmother's old metal file box. She claimed he just needed to verify some historical zoning boundaries to help me get a better appraisal. My own mother, the woman who raised me, had willingly handed over the architectural blueprints, the original deed copies, and decades of private family history to the man actively trying to destroy my life. Before I could even process the sheer magnitude of her betrayal, the heavy oak front door chimed. My cousin Vivian Shore strolled into the sitting room, dropping her heavy designer handbag onto the armchair. Vivian worked as an independent urban planning consultant. She always carried herself with a sharp, calculating arrogance, viewing every interaction as a potential transaction. She did not even flinch when she saw my pale, tear-streaked face. Elaine had apparently invited her over for an early dinner. Vivian poured herself a large glass of red wine from the crystal decanter and leaned against the door frame, watching me unravel. She did not offer a single word of sympathy. Instead, she offered a cold, calculated reality check. She looked at me with absolute disdain, swirling the wine in her glass, and stated plainly that I was always the type of person to sit on a mountain of gold without having the slightest clue how to dig. She sneered, telling me the neighborhood was rapidly changing, and people who actually knew how to turn useless dirt into real money were the ones who deserved to win. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with a sickening, terrifying clarity. Vivian was not just defending a ruthless business perspective. She was actively consulting for the exact development group trying to bulldoze my property. She was banking on a massive life-changing commission check the moment the commercial zoning was approved. I stood frozen in the center of my mother's perfect, suffocating living room and realized I was entirely surrounded. The enemy was not just waiting outside my door. They were sitting comfortably at my family dinner table, drinking expensive wine and waiting for me to lose. He wanted the valuable land. Vivian wanted her greedy cut of the profits. My mother simply wanted the illusion of a smooth, quiet life, even if it meant sacrificing my entire future and my sanity to the people manipulating her. I left the house without speaking another word to either of them. By the time I parked my car back in the city, the heavy social isolation had already begun to take root. My cellular phone buzzed constantly, but not with messages of support or concern. A mutual friend from my old social circle forwarded me a long, vicious text message thread. The narrative was already spinning wildly out of control across the city. People were saying I was having a severe, unhinged mental breakdown after the breakup. They were whispering that I was fabricating crazy conspiracy stories about real estate documents just to get my ex-boyfriend to pay attention to me. He was brilliantly painting himself as the concerned, patient, long-suffering victim of a hysterical woman who could not let go. The absolute professional death blow arrived via a bonded corporate courier exactly 2 hours later. He knocked on my front door and handed me a thick manila envelope bearing the official red seal of the Astron Mobility Group Human Resources Department. I tore it open standing alone in my hallway. It was a formal notice of indefinite suspension without pay effective immediately pending the conclusion of the internal fraud investigation. In a single catastrophic afternoon, I had been completely stripped of my salary, my hard-earned professional credibility, and my moral standing in the eyes of everyone I knew. I had no job. I had no family in my corner. I was completely radioactive to my friends. Night fell heavily over the city. I sat on the dusty wooden floorboards of my grandmother's empty living room. I did not turn on a single light. The thick darkness felt like a physical weight pressing down hard on my shoulders. The white envelope, from my company lay discarded on the floor beside me, a glaring reminder of everything I had lost. The silence in the old house was absolutely deafening. I had never felt so profoundly, hopelessly alone in my entire 34 years of existence on this earth. Then the heavy front door creaked open. The yellow street lights from the avenue cast a long narrow shadow across the entrance hall. Greer walked in. She did not knock. She did not hesitate at the threshold. She closed the door firmly behind her, shutting out the noise and the judgment of the city. She walked directly into the center of the dark living room and dropped her keys on the windowsill. She looked down at the official suspension letter resting on the floor. She looked up at my red, swollen eyes. She did not ask me if the terrible rumors were true. She did not ask me if I had secretly approved that fraudulent vendor at work to save myself. She did not demand an explanation, a defense, or a timeline of events. While my own blood relatives had sold me out for convenience and profit, the woman who had loved me in silence for 7 years simply sat down on the hard floor next to me. She pressed her shoulder firmly against mine in the pitch-black room, anchoring me to the earth, and proved without a single word that I was not fighting this war alone. Greer did not pull me into a tender embrace or whisper soft, comforting platitudes into my ear. The heady silence of the dark living room lasted exactly 3 minutes before the title examiner inside her took absolute control. She stood up abruptly from the dusty floorboards, walked over to the dining table, and pulled her silver laptop from her tote bag. The blinding white glow of the screen illuminated her sharp jawline. She looked at me with a gaze so intensely focused it made the air in the room crackle. If we wanted to survive this, she stated flatly, we had to immediately stop thinking like victims bleeding out on the pavement. We had to start thinking like the predators circling the block. She gestured for me to sit beside her. I dragged a wooden chair across the floor and looked at the complex spreadsheet glowing on her monitor. She took a deep breath and confessed something that made my chest tighten all over again. Long before the chaotic Friday night on her rooftop, long before my exhausted joke about marriage had cracked open our hidden reality, Greer had been silently standing guard over my life. She explained that she had a gut feeling my ex-boyfriend was not the type of man to walk away from a multi-million-dollar real estate prize simply because I broke up with him weeks ago. She had quietly set up a back-channel alert system in her office database to monitor any structural queries, title pulls, or zoning requests drawn against my grandmother's exact address. She tapped the screen, pulling up a chronologically ordered digital timeline she had meticulously built. It was a terrifying masterpiece of forensic accounting. She pointed to a date exactly 6 weeks prior. That was the exact day he suddenly started sending me those overly polite, strangely agreeable text messages, pretending he wanted to remain amicable friends. 4 days after that fake olive branch, the system logged a massive surge in quiet title searches initiated by an anonymous shell corporation. A week later, my cousin started casually texting me, asking highly specific, invasive questions about whether I had updated the property insurance or if I possessed the original paper deeds. Then, Greer traced her finger down to the exact Wednesday afternoon my corporate badge was swiped at the coffee shop downstairs. That was the precise hour the fake vendor was injected into my company's system. The architecture of their scheme was completely laid bare under the fluorescent glow of the laptop. It was a flawlessly executed 2-tier trap. They were not just stealing a piece of historic real estate. They were simultaneously loading massive corporate financial liability onto my shoulders to ensure I was completely paralyzed. If I tried to fight the forged real estate transfer, he would simply blow the whistle on the fake vendor approval, sending me to federal prison for corporate embezzlement. They had engineered a scenario where my only logical way out was to surrender the house quietly in exchange for him using his connections to make the company audit disappear. My first instinct was violent, blinding anger. I wanted to storm into the police precinct, hand over the laptop, and scream until someone arrested all of them. But Greer slammed her hand down on the table, her voice dropping to a low commanding register. She warned me that rushing into a legal battle right now would be absolute suicide. The evidence we had was entirely circumstantial and fragmented. If we ticked them off, he would immediately erase the intermediary signing portals, burn the shell companies, and leave me holding the bag with the corporate auditors. Her strategy was ruthlessly simple and incredibly dangerous. We were going to play dead. We had to let them believe the suspension had completely broken me. We had to make them think I was spiraling into a panicked, desperate surrender. If they thought they had already won, they would get sloppy. They would move to the final closing stages, and in their arrogant rush to secure the payday, they would inevitably make a fatal documented mistake. I sat back in my chair staring at the woman beside me. The street lights filtering through the dusty window panes cast long shadows across her face. For the very first time, I saw her through a completely different lens. She was not just the loyal best friend who brought me coffee and listened to my complaints. She was not just the woman who had secretly harbored a deep romantic love for me for 7 years. She was a brilliant, terrifyingly capable strategist who had been quietly standing right outside the spotlight for a decade, meticulously watching every single crack in my foundation, ready to reinforce the walls before I even knew the house was sinking. We spent the next 4 hours sitting on the floor of the hallway, tearing through the massive, heavy metal file box my mother had foolishly thought she had compromised. My mother had given him a key, but she had fundamentally misunderstood how my grandmother operated. The old woman never trusted banks or safe deposit boxes for the things that truly mattered. Hidden underneath a false cardboard bottom wrapped in a brittle yellowed manila folder was a stack of original hand-drafted architectural blueprints. Tucked inside the fold of the master blueprint was a single piece of stationery. It was a handwritten letter addressed to me dated 2 weeks before she passed away. I carefully unfolded the fragile paper. Her handwriting was shaky, but the ink was pressed deeply into the page. She wrote that the people swarming around the neighborhood only saw brick, mortar, and dollar signs, but to her, the house was never just a financial asset. She explicitly wrote that she was leaving this specific property to me because it was the ultimate protection for the last person in our bloodline who still knew how to keep their word. She knew her own daughter was weak to the influence of wealthy men. She knew my cousin was entirely driven by greed. She had left the property as a final test, a barricade against the exact type of vultures currently trying to tear my life apart. Reading those words felt like a physical electric shock straight to my heart. A profound, irreversible shift occurred inside my chest. The suffocating fear and the desperate need to simply clear my name completely evaporated. It was no longer about just proving my innocence to a board of corporate auditors. It was no longer about just keeping a roof over my head. I looked at the forged signatures on the laptop. I thought about my mother drinking tea while selling me out, my cousin sneering at me from the doorway, and the man who thought he could use my career as a loaded gun against my head. I wanted to teach them a lesson they would never ever forget. I wanted to force them to understand the catastrophic price of turning my family memories, my career, and my sanity into a cheap commercial transaction. I carefully placed the handwritten letter back into the folder. The silence in the room was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was the calm, sharp quiet right before a massive storm. I turned my body toward Greer. She was already looking at me, her dark eyes tracking the fundamental change in my posture. She did not ask if I was okay. She already knew the answer. I reached out across the space between us. I did not do it as a blind reflex seeking comfort. I did not do it because I was falling apart. I deliberately placed my palm over hers, lacing my fingers tightly through her own. It was a conscious, definitive choice. It was the sealing of a lethal alliance, an unspoken promise that we were going to burn their entire operation to the ground together. The morning after we uncovered the true depth of the betrayal, the air in the house felt fundamentally altered. I sat across from Greer at my small dining table, watching the early sunlight illuminate the steam rising from her coffee mug. My chest was tight, but my mind was clearer than it had been in months. I looked into her dark eyes and spoke the absolute truth. I confessed that my nervous system was still entirely too shattered to perfectly categorize every single emotion racing through my veins. The shock of my own family selling me out was still a raw open wound. But I told her there was one thing I knew with absolute unshakable certainty. When the entire world decided to turn its back on me, when my own mother traded my future for a quiet life, The only person I wanted standing next to me in the wreckage was her. I did not want to wait. I told her I did not want to spend another single day letting other people dictate the terms of my existence. I looked at her and suggested we go to the city courthouse. We decided right then to register for a civil marriage. It was not a theatrical performance to fool our enemies, nor was it a desperate, chaotic trauma bond. It was a deeply deliberate act of claiming my own agency. I wanted to actively choose the woman who had always chosen me, and I wanted to do it before anyone else could make another choice on my behalf. Beyond the profound emotional weight of the decision, our secret marriage carried a massive immediate tactical advantage. As my legal spouse, Greer instantly gained the closest possible legal standing to my life. My corporate career was frozen, my assets were under siege, and my reputation was being actively destroyed by malicious rumors. In the eyes of the law, a spouse is granted an impenetrable shield of privilege and access. She could legally step in to help me manage my private documents, authorize medical proxies if the stress physically broke me, and act as a verified representative for my private legal affairs without raising suspicion by slipping a simple gold band on my finger. I had unknowingly weaponized our love story into the ultimate defensive barrier. We went to the courthouse 2 days later. We did not wear elaborate dresses or carry expensive bouquets. We stood in a sterile wood-paneled room in front of a tired city clerk, wearing plain blazers, and made quiet promises to each other. When we walked back out onto the hot concrete of the city sidewalk, holding hands, I felt a strange, thrilling surge of power. The people trying to destroy me had absolutely no idea that the isolated, broken woman they thought they had cornered no longer existed. The moment we returned to her apartment, we initiated the first phase of the trap. I opened my laptop and drafted a carefully worded email to my ex-boyfriend. I forced myself to swallow every ounce of my pride and channeled the exact persona he expected to see. I wrote like a woman who had finally been crushed under the immense weight of the pressure. I told him I was completely exhausted. I admitted that perhaps he and my mother were right all along. I typed out a sentence saying I was willing to stop fighting and discuss the voluntary transfer of the property, but only under the strict condition that he use his corporate influence to completely squash the internal vendor audit at my company. I hit send and waited. I expected him to play games to make me sweat for a few days to assert his dominance. His reply arrived in my inbox exactly 14 minutes later. He took the bait so quickly and so aggressively that it proved a massive theory Greer had been developing. His email was overly accommodating, dripping with fake sympathy, promising that he could make my corporate problems disappear overnight if I just provided a clean, voluntary signature on a new set of transfer documents. His desperate speed confirmed that the forged documents he had already filed were not actually enough to finish his scheme. He absolutely needed my genuine, uncontested cooperation to finalize whatever massive financial deal he was brokering in the shadows. While I kept him busy with a steady stream of hesitant, defeated text messages, Greer went to work, using her legitimate professional channels. She dug aggressively into the corporate architecture of Port Meridian Holdings. After 48 hours of sifting through obscure state registry filings and commercial tax records, she cracked their shell. The holding company was nothing but a temporary ghost. Behind it was a ruthless, short-term mezzanine finance group notorious for acquiring high-value urban land by forcing minor document errors and bleeding independent property owners dry through legal attrition. They were not property developers. They were corporate scavengers. We knew we could not fight a massive financial institution and my ex-boyfriend using just our own fragmented evidence. We needed a mercenary. We found one in Mara Denby. Mara was a hardened civil litigator who operated out of a cramped, paper-filled office on the west side of the city. She did not wear designer suits, and she explicitly told us within the first 5 minutes of our meeting that she never promised her clients a quick or easy victory. But when Greer laid out the digital timeline, the forged notary stamps, and the fake vendor approval trap, Mara leaned back in her leather chair and smiled. She saw the intricate matrix of the fraud instantly, and she agreed to take the case and fight them to the absolute bitter end. Mara established one unbreakable rule for our operation. She instructed me to entirely eliminate all emotional confrontation. If I screamed at him, if I accused him of forgery, or if I threatened to call the police, he would instantly realize he was caught. He would burn the shell companies, destroy the communication logs, and walk away clean. Instead, Mara told me to play the role of the confused, compliant victim flawlessly. I had to let him feel completely in control. We needed him to outline his urgent demands, his financial requirements, and his revised contract terms directly through his own corporate email server. Every single message he said trying to manipulate me was another thread in the trap he was weaving for himself. That night, the summer rain hammered against the windows of Greer's apartment. The kitchen was entirely dark, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of my laptop screen resting on the granite counter. I stood there in the quiet shadows, reviewing a drafted response to a new list of demands my ex-boyfriend had just sent. Greer stepped up softly behind me. She wrapped her arms securely around my waist, resting her chin on my shoulder as we both stared at the glowing text. I raised my left hand to the keyboard to press the send button. The dim light caught the edge of the simple, unadorned wedding band resting perfectly on my ring finger. It was a breathtaking, incredibly dangerous contrast. I was wearing the quiet, beautiful proof of the best decision I had ever made in my entire life, while simultaneously signing my name to a ruthless, calculated plan designed to completely obliterate the men who thought they could bury me. The barrage of emails from Dalton arrived with a manic, escalating frequency. Sitting in Mara Denby's cramped, paper-strewn office, Greer and I watched the screen as our lawyer dissected every single sentence he sent. We were no longer reading the words of a confident, victorious real estate broker. We were watching a man who was quietly, desperately running out of time. Through his increasingly careless phrasing and his aggressive demands to finalize the paperwork by 5:00 on Friday, Dalton inadvertently revealed the true architecture of his scheme. He did not simply want my grandmother's property to add to his portfolio. He absolutely needed it. Mara pointed her silver pen at a specific paragraph where he mentioned consolidated zoning approvals and contingent fund releases. The historic row house was the geographical anchor for a massive financial package hanging over 6 adjacent lots he had already heavily leveraged. Without my exact parcel of land, his entire multi-million-dollar commercial development deal would instantly collapse into dust. Every time I thought I had seen the absolute bottom of their betrayal, the ground beneath my feet violently gave way, dropping me into a deeper, darker layer of the nightmare. Mara reached into her battered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. She slid it across the scratched wooden desk toward me. Her face was entirely grim. She had spent the morning quietly pulling the preliminary financial disclosures attached to the fake vendor account that my former company was investigating. She looked me dead in the eyes and explained that my forged digital signature had not just been used to transfer property. It had been utilized to open a temporary high-yield commercial line of credit for $250,000 under my name. The sheer terror of that revelation paralyzed my lungs. If this entire development deal exploded, or if Dalton simply decided to vanish in the middle of the night, I would not just lose my family home and my corporate career. I would be personally dragged into a catastrophic financial abyss, chained to a fraudulent loan I never authorized. They had weaponized my identity to borrow the very money they were using to steal from me. Greer, remaining completely unfazed by the mounting panic in the room, opened her own laptop. She had not slept. She had spent the last 48 hours relentlessly hunting Kent Barlow, the ghost notary, who had stamped my forged documents. She bypassed the standard public state registries and used her title agency credentials to cross-reference his digital stamp logs with late-night server uploads across the city. The results were chilling. She found that Barlow had authenticated at least 3 other major property transfers connected directly to Dalton's development group. Furthermore, he had executed these notarizations at 3:00 in the morning on weekends, times when legitimate legal offices were entirely shut down. We were no longer dealing with a single isolated incident of a bitter ex-boyfriend bending the rules to score a commission. We had stumbled into a highly organized systemic forgery ring operating in the absolute shadows of the urban real estate market, as if the universe decided I had not endured enough psychological torture for 1 week. My phone vibrated against the desk. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I answered it, tapping the speakerphone icon so Mara and Greer could hear the conversation. Elaine sounded incredibly weary, her voice lacking its usual pristine, controlling edge. Without any prompting, she launched into a monologue that completely shattered the final fragile remaining fragments of our relationship. She admitted with a heavy sigh that she had known for several months that Dalton intended to merge my grandmother's house into his massive commercial project. She genuinely thought she was doing me a massive favor by secretly encouraging him. She believed she was forcing her stubborn daughter to finally grow up and stop clinging to sentimental garbage. She claimed she had absolutely no idea he was going to forge documents or frame me for corporate fraud, but her ignorance offered no comfort. The absolute worst part was finally understanding her true motivation. My mother did not betray me for a lucrative cut of the profits like my cousin Vivian did. She sold me out because to her peaceful submission to wealthy, aggressive men was always far more important than fighting for what was right. She simply wanted the conflict to end, and she viewed me as the easiest acceptable casualty to maintain her own quiet, undisturbed reality. I ended the call without speaking a single syllable back to her. I needed to breathe. I needed to anchor myself to something tangible and real. When Greer and I finally returned to her apartment later that evening, I dragged my grandmother's heavy metal file box out from under the bed. I dug past the architectural blueprints and the handwritten letter we had found days prior, searching the absolute bottom corners of the rusted steel container. My fingers brushed against a thick-sealed parchment envelope secured tightly beneath a metal hinge. I carefully tore the brittle paper open. Inside was an original notarized legal addendum attached directly to the master property deed. It was a municipal preservation covenant that had never been digitized into the modern city system. My grandmother had legally bound the row house to an affordable housing preservation mandate for a strict period of 99 years. Greer read the dense legal text over my shoulder, her breath catching sharply in the quiet room. The implications of this single piece of paper were absolutely catastrophic for Dalton and his entire holding company. If he used his forged documents to bulldoze the property and push for immediate luxury commercial development, he was not just committing identity fraud against me. He was actively and massively defrauding his own corporate lenders and his wealthy private investors. He was in the process of securing tens of millions of dollars in institutional funding for a commercial project that was legally fundamentally impossible to build on that specific plot of land. He was constructing a towering financial empire on a foundation of absolute, undeniable quicksand. A fierce, blinding rush of adrenaline surged through my veins. I wanted to scan the addendum immediately, email it directly to the city zoning board, and watch his entire professional life collapse on the evening news. I wanted to burn him down right that second, but Greer grabbed my wrist gently, pulling me back from the emotional ledge. She reminded me, her voice steady and calculating, that we could not play our winning card yet. If we struck too early and showed him the addendum now, Dalton would simply claim total ignorance. He would quietly withdraw the forged zoning applications, erase the digital tracks connecting him to the intermediary portals, and ruthlessly throw Kent Barlow or my cousin under the bus to save his own skin. We had to wait until the absolute final moment. We had to wait until he was completely, inextricably locked into the fraud in front of an audience of powerful people he could not manipulate or escape. I understood exactly what needed to be done. I sat down at the kitchen counter, the soft blue glow of the laptop screen illuminating the gold wedding band resting securely on my left hand. I opened a new email draft addressed to my ex-boyfriend. I closed my eyes for a brief second, intentionally stripping every single ounce of anger, pride, and vengeance from my mind. I completely adopted the pathetic, defeated persona of a woman who had finally been crushed into total submission. I crafted a perfectly polite, entirely compliant message. I told him that I was incredibly exhausted from fighting the inevitable. I wrote that I was finally ready to meet in person to close all our unfortunate misunderstandings once and for all. I asked him to set up a formal private meeting room so we could sit down and discuss the official signing of his transfer documents. I read the message over one final time, making sure the tone was flawless. Then I hit send. I was willingly walking straight into the dark jaws of the trap, fully and terrifyingly prepared to snap them shut on his neck. I committed entirely to the performance of a woman who had finally shattered under the immense crushing pressure of her own life. The psychological warfare required me to swallow every single ounce of my pride and become exactly what they expected me to be. I started by systematically reaching out to our mutual acquaintances. I sent pathetic, rambling text messages apologizing for my recent erratic behavior. I told them I was incredibly stressed about losing my job and that the breakup had taken a much heavier toll on my mental health than I wanted to admit. When the vicious rumors about my supposed paranoia reached my ears, I did not utter a single word in my own defense. I let the silence hang heavy and thick, allowing it to validate their worst assumptions. I made sure word got back to Dalton that I was spending my days sitting in the dark, crying over my corporate suspension, desperate to just make the nightmare stop. My absolute manufactured surrender fed his massive, fragile ego perfectly because he believed he had entirely broken my spirit. He became spectacularly overconfident. His arrogance blinded him to his own operational security. In a rush to close his massive commercial development deal, he bypassed his own expensive legal counsel and emailed me a revised comprehensive term sheet directly from his personal corporate account. It was the fatal mistake we had been praying he would make. The new document was completely riddled with highly specific indemnification clauses. He explicitly demanded that I hold his holding company harmless for any administrative irregularities related to the intermediary signing portals and the third-party notarizations. These were intricate, deeply criminal operational details that only the central architect of the forgery ring would possess. By putting those exact terms in writing and sending them from his own secure server, he unknowingly handed us the exact, undeniable proof we needed to tie him directly to the fraudulent paper trail. My cousin Vivian could not resist the urge to twist the knife one last time. Stepping completely out of the shadows, she sent me a lengthy, condescending text message on a Tuesday afternoon. She wrote that she had spoken to Dalton and understood that I was finally ready to stop being so deeply difficult. She actually had the absolute audacity to suggest that if I just signed the final papers without causing a massive scene, our family might still be able to maintain a polite relationship for the upcoming holiday season. Her words were dripping with a cold, calculating arrogance. The message completely stripped away any lingering illusion that she was just an innocent, concerned bystander. She had already mentally spent her massive cut of the consulting profits. To Vibin, the theft of my inheritance was a completed business transaction, and my only remaining role was to quietly accept my defeat. While I played the role of the broken victim in public, Mara went on a brutal surgical offensive at the Astron Mobility Group headquarters. She did not ask the legal department nicely. She walked into the general counsel office and filed an aggressive binding preservation order, legally compelling the Human Resources Department to instantly lock down all internal server access logs, firewall queries, and security camera footage from the specific week of the vendor approval. The synchronized data proved exactly what we had suspected all along. The hide camera footage showed me clearly sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 4th floor, at the exact minute my secure terminal on the 7th floor was authorizing the fake consulting vendor. The internal corporate investigation violently pivoted from me to their own glaring security vulnerabilities. A senior systems administrator initially tried to brush Mara off, claiming their internal network was completely impenetrable to outside threats. His smug, dismissive demeanor evaporated into sheer panic the second Mara slapped a printed visitor access log directly across his desk. The log proved Dalton had used a temporary guest badge to enter the building on that exact Wednesday, supposedly to drop off a forgotten lunch bag at the front desk. The timing of his physical presence aligned perfectly with the fraudulent login on my computer. Dalton either had stolen my password and found an empty office to access the network, or he had a paid accomplice inside the information technology department holding the digital door wide open for him. With the noose quietly but securely tightening around his neck, I sent Dalton the exact message he had been desperately waiting to read. I told him I was incredibly exhausted and that I would attend a formal closing session to sign the clean transfer documents and end the dispute. We agreed to meet at private neutral closing room at a downtown escrow agency on a Friday morning. He replied almost immediately, his tone practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. He genuinely believed that after weeks of relentless psychological warfare, he was finally going to sit across a mahogany table and watch me physically sign away my entire life. Behind the heavy curtain of my surrender, Mara was meticulously assembling a silent, firing squad. She sent highly confidential, heavily encrypted legal notices to Dalton's primary commercial lender, the regional title insurance underwriter, the State Fraud Investigation Bureau, and the senior litigation counsel at Asterin. She laid out the entire undeniable matrix of the forgery, the fake corporate vendor, and the hidden affordable housing addendum that legally blocked his commercial project. However, she issued one strict, non-negotiable directive to every single powerful party involved. Absolutely nobody was allowed to make a phone call, freeze a bank account, or file a legal motion until she gave the final signal. She needed Dalton to walk into that room completely blind, believing he was the smartest, most invincible man in the city. The psychological toll of pretending to be completely destroyed for weeks was unbelievably exhausting. I felt like I was constantly holding my breath underwater. The only thing keeping my lungs functioning and my mind sharp during those dark days was Greer. Between the chaotic strategy sessions, the endless document reviews, and the terrifying legal maneuvering, we found quiet, painfully beautiful pockets of time just for the two of us. It felt as though our brand new secret marriage was taking deep roots right in the middle of a brutal, unforgiving war zone. Late one night, sitting on the cold tiles of her bathroom floor, while she gently washed the exhaustion from my face with a warm cloth, she leaned forward and kissed my forehead. No grand cinematic declarations of love were needed. She simply held the fragile pieces of my sanity together while I deliberately tore my own public reputation apart to set the trap. On the late Thursday evening, before the final closing, I stood completely alone in the master bathroom of my grandmother's house. The single overhead bulb cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across my face. I looked at the dark circles under my eyes, the pale drawn lines of my cheeks, and the messy state of my hair. I looked exactly like the shattered, desperate victim Dalton expected to see. I placed my hands flat against the cold porcelain sink, took a slow, deep breath, and stared directly into my own reflection. I practiced my lines for the morning. I said aloud that I was ready to sign the papers. I repeated the sentence 3 times carefully, perfecting a pathetic tremor in my voice and the heavy defeat in my posture. I was not practicing because I was actually weak or frightened. I was rehearsing because I wanted to experience the profound lethal satisfaction of letting a man dig his own massive grave simply because he had catastrophically underestimated the woman standing right in front of him. Friday morning arrived with a heavy overcast sky. The escrow agency was located on the 20th floor of a glass skyscraper in the center of the downtown financial district. I walked into the massive, pristine conference room at exactly 9 in the morning. I deliberately wore a faded gray wool sweater, flat black shoes, and absolutely no makeup. I kept my eyes cast downward, making sure my shoulders slumped forward in a posture of total, irreversible defeat. I sat alone at the far end of the long mahogany table, waited in silence. 15 minutes later, the heavy glass doors swung open. Dalton strutted into the room like a conquering king returning from a victorious war. He wore a navy bespoke suit, his hair perfectly styled, exuding absolute arrogance. Behind him trailed his personal defense attorney, a silent man in a charcoal suit representing the holding company, and my cousin Vivian. She had the incredible audacity to pull out the chair right next to mine. She placed a manicured hand softly on my arm, playing the sickening role of the deeply concerned family member who was simply there to guide me through a tragic but necessary transition. Dalton took the leather seat directly across from me. He steepled his fingers, staring at me with a perfectly calculated mixture of pity and triumph. He launched directly into his final, heavily rehearsed performance. He lowered his voice to a gentle, patronizing octave, telling the entire room that this whole situation was just a terribly unfortunate series of misunderstandings. He actually looked me directly in the eyes and claimed he was only pushing this settlement forward to save me from the disastrous corporate audit I had foolishly brought upon myself. He leaned closer across the polished wood, crossing the professional boundary, and brazenly brought up our past romantic relationship. He whispered that if I had just been reasonable and listened to his guidance 6 months ago, I would not be sitting here with a ruined career about to lose my grandmother's legacy. He flawlessly framed his deliberate theft as a tragic consequence of my own stubborn disobedience. A thick stack of contract papers rested directly in front of me, accompanied by a heavy brass pen. Vivian nudged the pen toward my resting hand, softly encouraging me to just sign the bottom line so we could all finally go home and heal. Instead of picking the pen up, I pulled the first page of the massive document toward me and began reading it in agonizingly slow, deliberate detail. I read every single line of the standard indemnification clauses. I traced my finger over the liability waivers. 5 minutes passed in total silence, then 10. Dalton began to shift uncomfortably in his expensive chair. His smug, polished veneer started to crack around the edges. He tapped the crystal face of his expensive watch, his tone growing distinctly sharp and irritated. He snapped that we did not have all day to review boilerplate legal jargon, pointing out that his wealthy investors were aggressively waiting on this exact document to authorize a massive wire transfer before the banking window closed at noon. I kept my eyes fixed on the paper, my voice a hollow, defeated whisper. I asked him why he desperately needed my physical signature today if he already possessed the other legally binding documents he had filed last week. I needed him to say it out loud in front of the specific people currently waiting out in the hallway. Dalton, entirely blinded by his own frantic impatience and greed, scoffed loudly. He stated clearly, projecting his voice for the entire room to hear, that my physical signature on this clean settlement was the absolute only way to legalize the missing piece of his consolidated zoning package and unfreeze the capital. He openly admitted that the previous filings were temporary placeholders, and this specific document was the critical keystone holding his entire multi-million-dollar financial empire together. The exact moment the confession left his mouth, I gently placed the brass pen down on the table and sat up perfectly straight. I did not say another word. The heavy door at the back of the conference room clicked open. Mara Denby walked in. She did not look like a scrappy neighborhood lawyer today. She wore a razor-sharp black suit and carried a thick reinforced leather briefcase. Behind her filed a terrifying procession of professional executioners. There was the senior fraud investigator from the State Commercial Department, the lead underwriter for the Regional Title Insurance Board, and the terrifyingly stoic general counsel from my former corporate employer. The smug smile vanished from Dalton's face in a fraction of a second, immediately replaced by a pale, rigid confusion. His personal lawyer sat up straight, instantly recognizing the severe corporate security badges the new arrivals were wearing on their lapels. Before Dalton could even formulate a single cohesive question, the door opened one last time. Greer stepped into the room. She bypassed the empty chairs and walked directly to my side of the table. She did not stand politely in the background like a supportive spectator. She placed her hand firmly and possessively on the back of my chair. Dalton sneered, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative, demanding to know why my overly involved best friend was crashing a private legal closing. Greer looked at him with absolute freezing contempt. She introduced herself clearly, not as my friend, but as my legal documented wife. Then she casually dropped her professional title, introducing herself to the room as the senior title examiner, who had personally logged and archived every single illegal query his shell company had made over the past 3 months. The massacre began immediately. Mara opened her briefcase and started dealing the evidence across the mahogany table like a dealer at a high-stakes casino. She dropped the printed security lobs, proving Dalton used a guest badge to enter my office building at the exact moment my terminal approved his fake vendor account. The corporate counsel for my company chimed in, confirming they had already located and suspended the corrupt information technology employee who had opened the internal firewall for him. Mara threw down the digital chain of custody showing the forged electronic signatures bouncing through illegal intermediary servers. Then, the title insurance underwriter laid out the massive stack of printed emails where Dalton explicitly tied himself to the fraudulent operational terms. Finally, Greer slid the original yellowed parchment addendum across the table. She explained in a perfectly level clinical voice that the property was legally bound to an affordable housing preservation mandate for 99 years. She pointed out to the state investigator that Dalton had willfully and maliciously concealed this massive zoning restriction from his commercial lenders, effectively committing massive wire fraud against his own financial backers by using the land as collateral for luxury development that was legally impossible to build. The room fell into a horrifying, suffocating silence. The trap had not just snapped shut on his ankle. It had completely crushed his entire professional existence, but the cornered animal did not immediately surrender. Dalton jumped up from his chair, his face flushed purple with desperate, panicked rage. He began frantically pointing fingers, desperately trying to construct a human shield out of the people who had loyally helped him. He screamed that the ghost notary was entirely responsible for the bad signatures and the illegal server routing. He spun around and pointed a violently shaking finger at Vivian, shouting that she was the one who had provided the private family documents and falsely promised the property title was clear. He even started raving about my mother, claiming she had orchestrated the entire handover behind my back, and assured him I would not fight. He was entirely willing to burn every single person in the room to the ground to buy himself a tiny sliver of plausible deniability. Watching him violently turn on his own allies, his composure completely shattered, I realized the absolute final blow had to be delivered immediately, right in that room before anyone could successfully scramble out of the wreckage. Dalton was still shouting, his voice echoing violently off the thick glass walls of the massive conference room. He was desperately scrambling to throw his own cousin, the corrupt notary, and even my mother directly into the fire to save his own skin. Mara Denby did not raise her voice to compete with his frantic, pathetic screaming. She simply unlatched her heavy leather briefcase one final time. She pulled out a single, heavily redacted financial commitment packet and placed it squarely in the dead center of the polished mahogany table. The sharp slap of the paper hitting the wood cut through his yelling like a gunshot. Mara explained, her voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register, that this was the master capital guarantee Dalton had submitted to his institutional lenders exactly 3 weeks prior to this morning. She read the second paragraph aloud for the entire room. In that specific clause, Dalton had legally certified in writing that he had already fully secured undisputed ownership and control of my grandmother's property. He had signed that binding financial guarantee long before I had ever supposedly agreed to sell. This single document instantly obliterated any desperate, lingering narrative that the forged signatures were just a road mistake by an overzealous real estate associate. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the fake documents were the calculated, premeditated foundation of his entire multi-million-dollar capital package. He had intentionally framed me for corporate fraud just to force my total compliance for a massive commercial loan he had already illegally secured behind my back. As the crushing weight of the federal wire fraud implications settled over the freezing room, my cousin Vivian completely collapsed. She did not even wait for the state investigator to formally question her involvement. Her arrogant, calculating facade dissolved instantly into ugly, panicked tears. Mara slid a printed stack of recovered emails toward her, clearly showing the exact messages where Vivian and Dalton had aggressively negotiated her specific percentage cut of the final commercial sale. The timestamps on those emails aligned perfectly with the exact hours the forged title documents were generated. Realizing she was entirely trapped with zero avenue for escape, Vivian immediately began sobbing and babbling, loudly confessing every single dirty detail of their private conversations. Without a single ounce of family loyalty, She frantically transformed herself into the ultimate cooperating witness against the entire group, begging the investigator for a plea deal to avoid going to a federal penitentiary. I turned my head slowly to look at my mother. Elaine was sitting rigidly in her expensive leather chair, her face completely drained of all color. For my entire 34 years of life, she had prided herself on maintaining a perfect, peaceful, deeply agreeable existence. She had genuinely believed she was just pushing her stubborn daughter to be decisive and practical about an old house. But as the state fraud investigator read the sheer terrifying scope of the criminal enterprise aloud, her pristine illusion completely shattered into a million pieces. She was forced to sit in that room and listen to how her own moral cowardice, her desperate, lifelong need to submit to wealthy men for the sake of an easy life, had actively provided the exact tools to destroy her only child. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a horrifying, crushing realization. But I offered her absolutely nothing in return. I gave her no forgiveness, no screaming anger, and no comfort. I simply gave her the cold, empty silence she truly deserved. The professional execution moved swiftly. The general counsel for my former company stepped forward, formally clearing his throat. He stated on the official record that my corporate suspension was immediately completely lifted. He confirmed that their internal network security team had successfully traced the unauthorized vendor approval directly to Dalton and his paid accomplice inside the information technology department. He offered me a profound formal apology and guaranteed my full salary, my senior position, and my professional reputation would be fully restored by Monday morning. Right after him, the regional title insurance underwriter stood up, angrily packed his briefcase, and announced he was entirely revoking all active insurance policies for the holding company. Hearing this, the commercial lender representative immediately walked toward the door, loudly stating that their financial backing was permanently withdrawn effective right this second. Dalton was completely, irrevocably, financially ruined in a matter of 5 minutes. The investigator then calmly confirmed Kent Barlow was already being pulled into a massive state licensing review that would end his career permanently by the end of the week. Dalton sank deeply back into his chair, completely defeated, his face buried in his shaking hands. His personal defense attorney, a man who clearly knew when a war was absolutely lost, desperately tried to stop the bleeding. He frantically pulled a blank settlement agreement from his bag, looked directly at me, and offered a staggering sum of hush money. He offered $2 million in clean, untraceable corporate funds if I simply signed a comprehensive, non-disclosure agreement right then and there. He wanted me to take the massive payout, keep my mouth entirely shut, and let them quietly sweep the criminal forgery under the rug to save Dalton from federal prison and total public humiliation. I looked at the printed settlement offer resting on the table. A younger, much more frightened version of myself might have taken the millions and run away to start a new quiet life, but I was no longer that easily managed woman. I looked directly into Dalton's red, panicked, deeply pathetic eyes. I told his lawyer to take the $2 million and burn it. I explicitly refused the silent settlement. True revenge was not about securing a secret payout in a dark room. True revenge was making absolutely sure that his name became permanently toxic. I told him I was taking every single forged document, every fake email, and every illegal contract directly into the public court record. I wanted every real estate broker, every commercial lender, and every wealthy investor in the entire city to know exactly what kind of monster he was. I wanted him to have absolutely nowhere left to hide. Several months passed. The chaotic, blinding dust of the legal battle eventually settled. Dalton was formally indicted on multiple severe federal fraud charges. Viben accepted a humiliating plea deal that completely ruined her independent consulting career forever. I never spoke a single word to my mother again. I kept my grandmother's historic brick row house. Instead of selling it or letting it sit quietly in the dark, I used my restored corporate salary to completely renovate the beautiful 3-story building. I turned the sprawling property into a vibrant, subsidized, collaborative workspace and affordable housing unit specifically designed for low-income female entrepreneurs. I honored the exact spirit of the preservation addendum my grandmother had left behind for me. I took the very asset they wanted to violently swallow out of pure greed and transformed it into a permanent breathing symbol of my own absolute survival. On a warm Friday evening in late September, the house was filled with the soft glow of amber lights and the comforting smell of roasted garlic. There was no massive, flashy wedding reception. There were no expensive catered dinners to prove anything to the outside world. It was just a quiet, intimate evening in the newly restored kitchen. I stood by the marble island, pouring 2 glasses of heavy red wine. Greer walked into the room, wearing a soft cotton sweater, and wrapped her arms gently around my waist from behind. She rested her chin perfectly on my shoulder, looking out the window at the quiet city street below. I leaned back against her warm chest, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of absolute peace settling deep into my bones. The exhausted, sarcastic joke I had made on a dark rooftop had miraculously guided me to the exact right person, and the most devastating, calculated betrayal of my entire life had inadvertently forged me into the most dangerous, liberated, and completely free version of myself. Thank you for listening to this story. Please leave a comment telling me where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by pressing the button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.